Hey, welcome to X-Oriente, the new voice of brotherhood. I am your host, Eric Diamond, and Jason Van Dyke, the normal Jason, is on. He's on special assignment. He has been assigned to go to Japan to drink as much Japanese whiskey and beer as he can get his hands on, eat as much sushi, and have a hell of a time, which I believe he is doing if Facebook pictures and Instagram are any indication. But we are pleased and honored to have as our fill-in guest host and my therapist for the evening, Jason Richards of the Masonic Roundtable fame. And do you do anything other stuff besides that?
I do some writing. I do some talking and do more talking on the Masonic Roundtable.
Cool. Yeah. So we're honored to have you, and thank you for doing this. And so I wanted to talk today about, so like every once in a while I'll kind of read something on social media. It kind of gets my hackles up, and this is a good it's a good process to kind of work through this, kind of take it all in and kind of make sense of it. So the article in question was by our good brother and friend Chris Hodapp, who has been I like to refer to him as the AP wire service of Freemasonry, because he seems to get all the news first. But he wrote an article that I thought was really interesting. It was called "How the 1960s Really Killed Freemasonry's Future." Jason, you took a look at it. Did you? I mean, before I get into my rant, I mean, what were your impressions? Because you're the reasonable of the two of us tonight.
So yes, I'm more than happy to let you do your old man yells at cloud impression for the rest of the show. But it was interesting. I really like Chris's writing and
Mm-hmm.
really love his work. It was an interesting article from the sense that for those viewers that haven't read it, his premise is that the death and decline of Freemasonry had its beginnings in the 1960s with the corresponding death of the McGuffey Reader system in the United States public education system. And the idea being that up until that point, when the McGuffey Readers were in common usage, it provided a firm foundation of education, of civics, of literacy for the masses in the United States as far as their education is concerned. And with the phasing out of those McGuffey Readers, that took away that common system and that common foundation of education based on being a good citizen and reading the literary greats, etc.
Yep.
For me, I think it's it's an interesting premise, but at the same time, Chris seems to hit on this happening right around the same time as the initial decline of Freemasonry in 1959, and from my standpoint, if the McGuffey Readers were phased out during an elementary educational system, you would anticipate that there would be a generation or so, or a period of at least if these kids are 8 years old, a period of at least 10 years before that impact would be seen in a Masonic aged individual. So for me, I'm a little skeptical about the dates and the specific causality that Chris draws between these correlations, just because I don't know if the dates really add up.
Mm. Okay. And even look, Chris himself, I mean, I'm a big admirer of Chris's. I love his writing too. And sometimes what I love is when he writes something like this that kind of gets me to thinking and gets me chewing on leather and stuff like that, because it it's provocative, and that's, to me, that's the best kind of Masonic writing. And he himself in the kind of in the first couple paragraphs, he says that, he notes, he says, I was engaging in the very sort of monster hunting that I've accused others in an effort to just see what the original tipping point really was. So I think for Chris, and I, not to put words in his mouth, and Chris, if you're listening to this, or you do listen to this and you want to come on the show and talk about this article and kind of what your intent was and stuff, you are always welcome here. So I'm not sure how committed he is to this, or, he says, I'm dead, I quote him, he says, I'm dead serious about this. I'm not so sure it's as causal as he makes it out to be, but it's kind of an interesting thing. So one of the issues that I had with this article was, is that it kind of, in a way, it's somewhat, I want to say blame the victim, but it's not really a victim blaming kind of thing, but it's sort of like his premises is that people, men stopped joining Freemasonry because they didn't have a grounding in moral education. And if that's the case, then what is Freemasonry for, if not to provide moral education to men, right? In other words, if men aren't moral enough to, I guess the lack of a moral education doesn't necessarily mean that the person is amoral, right? Or anti-moral, right? It just means that they don't have a firm sort of grounding in that. But he says,
and to Eric, that moral education can also come from other sources, whether it be Sunday school or, parents or other things. So there's that as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that he says, as a direct result of McGuffey's books and the teaching method that came about, the Americans who fought in the Civil War in the 1860s as 20-year-olds were the first literate, mass-educated generation of the modern world. And that's true. The literacy rates during the Civil War were around 90% on both sides. I think it was like 80% among the Confederates, 90% among Union. But then he says that's why Civil War era letters and diaries from soldiers on both sides of the conflict are so vivid and numerous today compared to previous eras. Now, I actually did a little digging into this, and what I found was that that's a bit of a false cause, because the letters are vivid and numerous because they were saved. So we have the letters that were saved, and those are mostly saved by upper middle and upper class white families. And so we get this sort of, so in other words, it's a bit of a self-selection. So the letters that were saved, chances are, were written by people who are better educated. And in fact, there is a lot of documented evidence to show that there were actually people who would write letters on behalf of men who weren't as literate and maybe weren't as good expressive writers. And he said, so his premise is that when the McGuffey readers were yanked out of schools in the early 1960s, it had what is clearly a direct and arguably corrosive effect on society at large, and for the purposes of the story, on Freemasonry itself. So he says that the readers, so basically for those who don't know, the McGuffey readers was the first sort of standardized mass curriculum for reading in the United States. It was started in the 1830s by this guy McGuffey, who was a Presbyterian minister, and so the books are these very sort of basic readers, and like most readers in a language, they start out with sort of phonics, kind of like the cat sat, those types of things. So it's, if you're familiar with Dick and Jane books, they were kind of like that, except that, it was 1830. So it wasn't, it was sort of, a lot of it was sort of came out of the educational materials of the time, which were mostly things like copybooks and stuff like that. So there's a lot of biblical stories, a lot of things like Aesop's fables, and and they taught not just not just the language and the phonics part of it, but they sort of had these little kind of moral lessons in them. And so Chris's point was that because this was such a universally used curriculum, and it was pretty much nationwide, because of that, basically everybody was kind of reading out of the same book. And so that created a sort of a sense of homogeneity around sort of the idea of America and American values that he believes, kind of set the stage for sort of a uniquely American culture that kind of everybody could buy into. That with the death of the McGuffey Reader in the 1950s, everything started to go, to hell in a handbasket. Now, you're how old? Roughly?
I am 36 years young.
Okay, so you're 36 years young. I'm 54 years young. And when I'm a product, my primary school education is a product of the 1970s. So I remember Dick and Jane. But I can tell you that like at that time, even though I was not exposed to the McGuffey Reader, right? We still read, things like Washington Irving. So what he talks about is, let's see, he talked about, Shakespeare,
John Milton,
Dr. Johnson, Byron, Charles Dickens, Sir Walter Scott, Washington Irving, founding fathers like Franklin and Jefferson. Now, not having the benefit of the McGuffey
this is all stuff that I read. Yeah, this is all stuff that I ended up reading throughout later elementary school as well.
Yeah, me too.
Federalist Papers, etc.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So like in fact, we committed The Ride of Paul Revere, Washington Irving's poem. We committed that to memory. We recited that every morning. So we did the pledge. We did Paul Revere. We named all the presidents. We recited the Gettysburg Address in its entirety, the preamble to the Constitution. I mean, we had quite a morning ritual, right? And so I guess my first criticism is that the McGuffey Reader didn't necessarily axe this from the curriculum. Now, when you went to school, where did you go to school? Where was it, like your elementary school? What state?
So I grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia. So a lot of my elementary school was right there in Charlottesville, outside of a stint overseas.
Oh, okay. So mine was in Silver Spring, Maryland. So it's possible that there was kind of a regional thing going on there, because we went to school kind of sort of close. I'd say within a couple of hours. Charlottesville, though, it's a bit of a schlep from like DC.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Hour and 45 minutes, depending on what side of the city you're on.
Yeah. So then he talks about the McGuffey's method stressed the importance of speaking properly, the mental discipline of memorization, and then he starts to like the tell starts to come. He says they were made more patriotic in nature and taught what we call today the civil religion, what later critics sneeringly came to mock as middle class values. Right now, this is where like one's personal philosophy starts to kind of color. Right. So in other words, clearly, I think what happened here was that this kind of hit a nerve with him. Like he was already kind of predisposed toward this line of thinking, and it started to kind of, like there's a bit of confirmation bias here.
Well, you see in kind of some of the things that Chris picks out, as specific things that the McGuffey readers, included, specifically like a lot of biblical stories, biblical passages. And then he goes through some of the iterations and the revisions that occurred with the McGuffey reader set and said, well, some of the biblical stories were taken out, but not all of them. And that to me exposes a little bit of that unconscious or even conscious bias as well.
Mm-hmm. And so, and then he gets into the blame game that he calls it the blame game that hurls race and gender roles into the wider societal slop bucket. So he's clearly buying into this idea of sort of the culture wars, right? Which I kind of reject. And he is very critical of SRA, which he let me see if I can find this, because I thought it was very interesting. Let's see. Just trying to find that passage. He talked about the SRAs that were mostly created by New Yorkers, which I thought was kind of interesting. But the truth is that the here. So it says, so are McGuffey's reading about rural life and ethics. Gone to were the standardized classical reading excerpts found in more advanced readers. So were McGuffey's readings about rural life and ethics in favor of SRA reading exercises that leaned more heavily on the cynicism and sophistication of city dwellers, overwhelmingly New Yorkers, regarding small town life and middle class morality. And I just thought it was kind of like that. Hey, you kids, that started to read like that to me. And I did a little research into SRA, and it was actually started in 1950 in Florida, by a guy who also was a minister. And while I couldn't find, right now SRA, for those who don't know, SRA stands for it's what is it? I can't remember now. It's like something reading. It's called the SRA Lab, Standardized Reading something Aptitude Labs or something like that. And today it's owned by McGraw-Hill, and it's still used in classrooms. And so the idea of SRA, for the people who weren't exposed to it, is that SRA was like a series of cards. And what the guy who started it was trying to do was create, he called it a learning machine, kind of a technology where education could proceed at the pace of the student rather than sort of everybody kind of, learning at the same pace and the same rate. And what's interesting about that is that when you look at 1830s, that's pretty much how schools worked, right? Is like the instruction was very individualized depending on what level a person came in. So you might have a 6-year-old who is much more advanced as a reader than someone who maybe was 9 or 10 years old who had maybe just started school for whatever reason. And so the old curriculum allowed you to sort of move at the student's pace. And then kind of in the Industrial Revolution, we kind of adopted what was called the Prussian method of education, which was sort of like it was really sort of taking mass production ideas and turning them into education. And SRA was sort of an attempt to rebel against that a little bit and to go back to this individualized instruction. So the idea would be they were all color coded depending on how I think it started at like yellow at the bottom and gold at the top, and you kind of worked your way through the colors, and it gave you these sort of intrinsic rewards of having completed the levels, right? And then you'd work your way through the system. And so it's, like I said, it's still used today, and it's owned by McGraw-Hill, and they're very secretive. It's like to go out and find stuff in the public domain on SRA. It's hard to do because it's such a proprietary kind of thing. But I was able to find some old articles from the early days of SRAs. And they were things like, Captain Cook Finds a New Land, The Man Who Created Tarzan. So it was a little biography of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Biographies of Thomas Edison and George Washington Carver. So these, to me, these don't seem like New Yorkers imposing their will on rural values and ideas, especially, like the story of George Washington Carver. I mean, it's a rural story, right? So, so he talks about he said that the second half of the baby boomers, of which I'm on the cusp, I'm right at the beginning of Generation X, became the first generation to learn how to read without McGuffey's guiding voice about ethics, virtue, morality, manners, language, and introduction to the classics. And it's replaced by what modern sociology majors call the salad bowl, in which we share very little in common. And then he gets sort of into the Freemasonry part of it, right? Where he says, Freemasonry included, along with the Oddfellows, Knights of Pythias, the Red Men, the Woodmen, etc., consider that those pre-1960s generations were not put off by what many see as tortured language in the rituals or Albert Pike's prose. What many modern Masons see as creaky or anachronistic sage plays in the Scottish Rite were common currency up to 3 generations ago, when your next-door neighbors were still actively involved in local theater groups and every teenager learned debating and speech-making.
We didn't have The Bachelorette or Survivor at that point in time.
We did not. But we had, Speed Racer and Johnny Sacco. I mean, right? And it's sort of like, if you were to go back to 1960 and ask people what was, what's wrong with Freemasonry, they would, I think that, every generation wants to blame it on the kids, right? Kids today, they're too permissive. It's that rock and roll, And so I feel like that.
Well, obviously there's nothing wrong with us.
That's right.
So we are not to fault for all of society's downfall.
That's right.
It's got to be somebody else. Who else can we blame?
Exactly. So then I started looking. So there was a big asterisk in his piece, and he said that he drew a lot of his inspiration from a book by Charles Murray called Coming Apart. And for those who don't who aren't familiar, so Coming Apart is one of those sociological sort of tomes. It's a bit of political philosophy, it's a bit of literary criticism, trying to mask itself as social science. And there's been a lot of books like this. Bowling Alone is another example, which we've talked extensively about, I think, on both of our podcasts. But then also there was one a few years ago called The Bell Curve, which sort of posited that certain races were better suited to success than other races. And again, these are stir up a lot of controversy and I don't know. They're pot stirrers. They're social pot stirrers, I think. And that's what Coming Apart does. And what Coming Apart is a sort of a, Murray looks at the history of white America between 1960 and 2010, which is, I think, why, that's kind of where Chris got the whole, McGuffey readers getting pulled in the 1960s. Murray kind of mentions that in his book. And so then I went into a little bit into the criticism, but before I do that, there's been a bunch of comments, and I just wanted to kind of take a look at some of them. Jeff Dyer says that the U.S. has always been one of the most literate societies. In order to have a relationship with God, one has to be able to read it. That's interesting.
I disagree, but okay.
That's interesting. Well, it turns out not to be the case. The U.S. is like 40th, I think, or something. You know, like the U.S. has a literacy rate of about 86%. Cuba, on the other hand, has a literacy rate of 100%. As does Norway, and you know, there's a lot of other countries that come before the United States in terms of literacy. And then we had a lot of comments about how people really loved SRA. I hated it. I thought it was boring as hell, but there were a lot of people in the comments who really liked SRA. Did you do SRA?
I didn't, no.
Okay. Let's see. Yeah. All right. So the criticism, right? So one of the things that he says is, one of the criticisms is first of all, the timeline that Murray uses. So he looks at 1960 to 2010, and, the best criticism that I found of this book was written by David Frum, who is he's a conservative writer. I normally don't agree with him very much on very many things, but I thought that this particular critique was valid. He said, suppose instead Murray had looked at the whole past century rather than just half of it, 1910 to 2010. He'd have found a different and even more suggestive trend, a white working class that has become more law-abiding, more temperate, more familiar, and more civic-minded between 1910 and 1960, and then ever less after 1970. And I thought that was really interesting. Right? So between the years of 1910 and 1960, right? Our standard of living goes up. Our moral fiber is increased. We're more law-abiding. We have more respect for institutions. And guess what? Freemasonry is in a growth curve, right?
Yeah, booming.
Right? It's booming. And he says, why is that? Right? So why is it? He says that America became more culturally stable between 1910 and 1960 as it became less economically and socially libertarian. As it became more economically and socially libertarian after 1970, America became less culturally stable. The greatest generation was also the statist generation. Like them or loathe them, the middle decades of the 20th century were an entirely anomalous period in American history. Never had the state been so strong, never had people submitted as uncomplainingly, never had the country been more economically equal, never had it been more ethnically homogenous. Seldom was its political consensus more overpowering. He says, Murray nostalgically
I feel like
regrets...
that's because we lost almost an entire generation in World War I and II.
Did we? I mean, did America? I know that they did in Europe.
Oh. Well, I guess it was, what, 1 million to 1.5 million?
Mm.
So perhaps
Okay.
I'm exaggerating on that part.
But here's what's interesting. So what happened was after the war, right? All these guys come back, and the government basically like hung them out to dry, right? There was no GI Bill. There was no treatment at the time for PTSD or anything like that. And so you had this sort of state of unrest. And because he says that, let's see, it's really kind of interesting. He talked about like the income in like economic inequality. And he said that one of the things that happened in the mid-century was like you had the progressive era, and then after which you know, as Mike Myers is fond of saying, was neither progressive nor an era. Discuss, right? But you had the progressive era, and then right on the tails of that, you had the New Deal, right? And so you had sort of a ramping up of what is essentially government, government involvement in kind of everyday life. And what Fromm said was that there was, however, one hugely important difference between those days and our own. Back then, the lower class, rather than sink meekly into its immiseration, periodically erupted in violent strikes and riots. American labor relations in the period from 1880 through 1920 were the most violent on earth. In 1901, an anarchist murdered President McKinley. In 1919-20, a bloody wave of bombings culminated in an explosion on Wall Street that killed 38 people and wounded 400 more. Many elite Americans decided something had to be done. Yes, they engaged in a great deal of lecturing and scolding recommended by Charles Murray, but they also worked to find ways to ameliorate conditions for working Americans. Violent strike-breaking went out of style to be replaced by gentle managerial practices. State governments enacted wage and hour laws. Even the federal government acted to enforce national food safety standards in 1906. There was the famous progressive era. Labor violence dwindled in the 1920s, and from the Depression and war emerged a middle-class society, the society that Charles Murray remembers so fondly from his youth in Newton, Iowa. That society did not spontaneously materialize. People who wanted to live in a world that offered more chances to more people consciously built institutions that extended opportunity and provided security to more Americans than ever before. Obviously, what they did cannot be repeated now. Conditions are different, but we can be inspired by their example. There's a lot there. And my question to you, and it's funny because now we're starting to we're kind of creeping toward politics, right? I don't know if you're getting uncomfortable. I'm getting a little uncomfortable, right? Because we're trying to avoid talking about that. But at the same time, I'm not sure that it's politics. It sounds like philosophy or morality to me. But what are your thoughts?
Well, and it's very difficult to it's difficult to distinguish politics from philosophy and morality, and I think I think Masonry does itself a disservice when it slams the door of politics and religion in brethren's face, and I see that more as perhaps how to say it appropriately. I see that more as a crutch for folks who can't actually have a learned discourse without getting their feelings hurt and attacking other people, as opposed to an actual effort to preserve the peace and harmony of the brethren. If you delve into civics, if you delve into philosophies, these are the very topics that our founding fathers delved into, when they were figuring out what to do as the British colonies. So you can't tell me that religion and politics are completely divorced from Masonry. They aren't, and they never will be. But as learned men, and as men who pride ourselves on having training in the 7 liberal arts and sciences and the classical education model, we should be able to employ at least those first 3 liberal arts, namely rhetoric and logic, to have a learned discourse on things approaching religion and politics. And so for me, perhaps the McGuffey Readers, getting back to Chris Hodapp's blog post, perhaps the McGuffey Readers instilled that sense of logic and rhetoric in the minds of the younger generation, the educational generation of that time. But for me, I think we've just lost our way as far as being able to talk about religion and politics in a way that's constructive and that both sides learn from, as opposed to feeling attacked by.
So something, and I'm almost out of sort of Charles Murray ranting, but there was something that I thought was kind of interesting when you think about whether you fall, whether you consider yourself on the liberal end of things or on the conservative end of things, or like me, kind of in the middle, how you frame something, how you look at it, really colors, I think, how you're going to react to kind of outside stimuli. So, and I think, Chris has a certain worldview. He has a certain point of view on things. And I think what he found in this story of the McGuffey Reader and Murray is something that kind of resonated with him. And I think this is the danger that we face as a fraternity, because what seems like common sense isn't necessarily common sense to me, to my ear, right? So what seems like would be a causal agent, right? So, what he's saying is like, the problem with Freemasonry today is that we have a whole generation of people who don't really care about morality at all, right? And that's really tempting. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotes that we read about in the news that sort of reinforce that and suggest that and say, okay, yeah, I could see that. But what Fromm is saying is in criticizing Murray's book, is that it really has to do with the amount of social safety net and wealth redistribution that had an effect on how people regarded their institutions. And so that kind of has a point of view bias to it as well, right? Like you can look at those things and say, okay, there's somebody who kind of, looks at the New Deal somewhat favorably and looks at things like a social safety net somewhat favorably. And so there was this really interesting passage where, so Murray said, he talked about like on being a man, like there was this little passage that he wrote on what it is to be a man. He said, to be a man means that you are brave, loyal, and true. When you're in the wrong, you own up and take your punishment. You don't take advantage of women. As a husband, you support and protect your wife and children. You're gracious in victory and a good sport in defeat. Your word is your bond. Your handshake is as good as your word. It is not whether you win or lose, but how you play the game. When the ship goes down, you put the women and children into the lifeboats and wave goodbye with a smile. Thoughts? Reaction?
I think everybody is, and I'll apologize to the viewers, by the way. There's like a 5 or 6 second delay, which is why Eric and I are talking over each other. But that aside, I think everybody's looking for a smoking gun here, and I don't think that gun exists. I think there are a lot of different pieces of society that are moving in very complex ways that shifted over the course of the 1950s into the 1970s, and I don't think it's possible to nail it down to just a move away from morality, because we know that that's not true today. Yes, organized participation in organized religion is decreasing almost at the same rate of Masonic membership. However, conversely, there is a proportionate increase in a focus on spirituality and personal spiritual journeys. So, one could say that today, folks are just much more distrustful of religious and social institutions than they were back in the 1940s and 50s. But I think these are all interesting points, but I really don't think there's a smoking gun as to why society shifted the way it did. I think if anything, there are like 15 to 20 smoking guns.
That's a lot of guns. So, all right. So let me then.
Society was big into the NRA, though.
So let me ask you then. What are your thoughts on why aren't men joining? because originally, I mean, I remember
Why aren't?
back.
Oh, good.
I just remember back in the day when we were all so excited about the millennials. We said, "Oh, the millennials, they're going to save Freemasonry," right? Didn't really happen. I mean, it did. I mean, it's we're getting some guys, we're getting some new members, we're starting to see some revitalized lodges, but it's not really moving the needle.
Not for lack of trying. For
Not for
some
lack of
of us
trying, yeah.
millennials who are in here.
Yeah.
So I think part of this goes back to that generation gap that we've talked about. We had you on the Masonic Roundtable to talk about the generation gap. There's a culture clash in Freemasonry, as there is in a lot of religious institutions as well. My church, the United Methodist Church, is dealing with a culture clash right now on the topic of LGBT inclusion, and it's ripping my denomination apart. You see very similar veins in Freemasonry as well. Why aren't men joining? I think it's a couple reasons. They don't see perhaps the relevancy in an organization that is largely one of the largest still deeply segregated organizations in the United States today, between us and Prince Hall Freemasonry. Two, it's there's a preponderance of other activities, and so the Freemason value proposition isn't strong enough compared with the opportunity costs of doing Masonry vice doing something else. So I think a lot of it comes down to just basic economics and basic business sense of, Freemasonry's value proposition isn't as strong as it used to be when it was the only game in town and everybody and their fathers were joining in droves. So we have more outside ways to spend our time and energy. And we perhaps don't see we see some perhaps anachronistic tendencies of the fraternity that purports itself to be a fraternity of very learned men who thrive on discourse, being still dealing with things like racism and LGBT inclusion or exclusion. That's that's my thought as to why folks aren't joining.
Okay, so I'm going to jump to my notes here. One second. So I kind of wrote a little note to myself, and feel free to jump in and tell me I'm wrong if I'm wrong.
You're wrong.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
I got it out of the way early. Good night.
Number one, we don't actually do anything around what we preach.
I agree.
Right. Okay. Two, we don't take a point of view that is compelling to today's man. Like, we don't take an issue. We don't take
also
a stand
agree
on racism and stuff. We have a disconnect between consumerist attitudes and communitarian attitudes, social perspectives.
So explain that a little bit more.
Okay. So there's this philosophy that emerged kind of in the mid 1800s and has sort of developed, and it kind of ebbs and flows, but it's called communitarianism. And it's one of those words that like people hate because it has the word "com" in it, which some people like to kind of conflate with communism, but it really has nothing to do with communism. The idea of communitarianism. So communitarians are like the opposite of what we would call libertarians, right? So philosophically, a libertarian is someone who believes in the primacy of the individual over the group, and that rights are about protecting the agency and the freedom of the individual at the expense of groups and institutions. communitarians kind of take a different approach. They say that no, actually, the community, like humans are social creatures, and that we are part of a community, and that community is actually more important than the individual, right? And that a healthy society is a balance between individual rights and the needs of the community. So things like common good, things like, it could be an issue like taxation, like, having fair and equitable taxes, redistribution of wealth, which is
I've been told taxation is theft.
Yes. And I know, yeah, I've been told that too, probably by the same people. Yes.
I love you, John.
But here, let me show you this. So this is kind of a diagram of sort of the communitarianism spectrum, right? So at the top we have communitarianism in opposition to individualism, and then we have sort of leftism and rightism, right? So your rightism is sort of your more conservative aspect. I'm not sure why they chose why leftism is red and rightism is blue. It probably should be the other way around, but I don't know. But anyway, but what's interesting is that when you have sort of a leftist communitarian approach, you have sort of an economic focus on community and a cultural focus on community. So what that really means is that if you think about Freemasonry is kind of a communitarian philosophy and organization, because we sort of in our liturgy, in our ritual, in our lectures, we talk about charity. We talk about helping the people who need it, giving everybody a free chance, being on the level, things like that. So we misuse the word charity, but anyway, we do. But what it says is that it's economically liberal but socially conservative. Whereas sort of an individualistic, and these are sort of like, I would sort of lump together the adherents of Ayn Rand and sort of, kind of extreme libertarians, is sort of culturally liberal and socially liberal and economically conservative. Right. And so that's kind of the, what you're seeing here. This is sort of the classic spectrum of how people kind of view the idea of communitarianism. And so what I'm saying is that, like, we have this, at the time when the McGuffey Reader came into being in the 1830s, the purpose of education in the United States was to build a populace that had, that was capable of functioning in a democracy, that was capable of reading a newspaper, that was capable of being informed, and capable of casting a vote. That changed after the Civil War. After the Civil War, the focus on education shifted into creating a workforce that was suited to the industrial age. Right. So we got, we had bigger classrooms, we had more structured curricula and stuff like that. And there was an expectation of graduating high school, which in the 1830s, I mean, you got out of grade school, you're considered educated, right? And very, very few people went on to a university or something like that. Today, our educational system seems to be geared toward creating savvy consumers. And because of that sort of consumerist ideology, that sort of like we've become, we view our country as sort of like, as the individual is sort of atomic, in that, we're like a bunch of atoms just sort of floating around in space. And to the extent that we kind of form alliances to work toward common purposes, it's kind of tenuous, and it just, there's a very great swath of what's in it for me. So, for example, we talk about like CEO pay inequity, and this is something that Murray talked about in his book a little bit. And he talked about how, there's this sort of there's this sort of one of the things that he did is he sort of blames it on the elites, right? He says that the elites, and by elites he means sort of the liberal, politics of identity, the coastal, elites that from time to time you see, folks like Chris railing against. The Chardonnay swilling, NPR listening kind of liberal elites, right? This is sort of a trope. But what he says is that the elites in the 1920s, right, had this sense of norms, seem, like things would be considered unseemly. And we talked a little bit about this idea of noblesse oblige, right? That if you were blessed by God with prosperity, you had a duty to sort of give back a little bit, because otherwise it would look like you're kind of a jerk, right? So there was that need for that. And so he, Fromm in his critique, so on that sort of being a man, about, if you, that passage that I read a little while ago about, being loyal and true and being a good sport and everything like that, those are all the individual aspects of manhood, but there's nothing that's really sort of social about those. And Fromm says, let me propose an alternative list of cliches that would truly command less assent today from the upper class Americans than they would have done in 1962. To be an employer means that you pay a fair day's wage for a fair day's work. If your firm goes broke, you go broke too. You don't take advantage of clients or customers. As a voter and citizen, you try to think about what is best for everyone, not just you. You eschew ostentation when times are good, and you pay your fair share of the cost when times are bad. Your good name matters more than money. Your contributions to your community define your good name. Whenever you're inclined to criticize anyone, just remember that not everybody was born with the advantages you had. I mean, that comes kind of right out of George Washington's Rules for Civility. And what I'd say is like, right? And what I'd say is like being a man is like both of those, right? It's not just the individual characteristics.
It's interesting because as you're reading off that list, especially, as you look at, generally speaking, the world today, and the CNN and, NBC pundits, etc., like I couldn't see any of those really holding true, at least at kind of the macro level. So it was just really interesting to hear you kind of read off that list and realize, okay, in different microcosms, those might exist, but for society as a whole, I wouldn't use any of those tropes to describe the society in which we live at present.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is like, so if you looked at something like CEOs, right, and corporate behavior, fiscal responsibility would demand this idea of, if you can take advantage of your customers and get away with it, you're obligated to do that to increase shareholder value. Right. And so there's that, there's that breakdown. I think, I would agree with Chris in that there is kind of a bit of a moral breakdown in this country, but I think the breakdown is sort of in the idea of the abandonment of the commons.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can see where you're coming from with the idea of the rise of the individual vice, the focus on the greater, the communal good. I still think that exists today, but it's more in various microcosms. Well, whether it be like NGO work or various nonprofit works or entities or faith-based organizations, etc. Vice being just an everyday learned characteristic. We're taught that, hey, no one's going to take care of you but you, and you need to act in your own interest, and perhaps that's where society went wrong.
Perhaps, or perhaps it was the fact that those aspects were considered a duty, not just a virtue. right? So like if you do charity work, that's considered virtuous, but it's not considered an obligation. Whereas I think in earlier times, people thought of it as an obligation. And so if you wanted to be a gentleman, right? Like let's say I'm a lower middle class guy who aspires to be an upper middle class guy. I'm joining the Freemasons because they're going to give me an opportunity to demonstrate that I am fulfilling those duties of being charitable, right? And raising money for charity and going out and, doing those things that sort of demonstrate to the world, this is a noble person because they do these things. And that's what's expected of a gentleman. So I said for, my number 4 was a lot of us carry a belief, and this isn't universal, and this is not part of the Masonic, I think, like Masonry on paper, but I've seen a lot of it in the fraternity. A lot of us carry a belief in charity for the deserving, not charity for all. Agree, disagree?
We even see that in Freemasonry today, which is really interesting because, you know, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, there's a brother in distress. It's like, well, is he really in distress? Is he paid up on his dues? Is he like clandestine or NPD? I've seen that go on in lodges where lodges will debate whether or not to extend charity to someone just because that brother may have not been to lodge in a long time, or may have dropped off the roster.
Yeah. Number 5, we don't have a clear sense of purpose.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, we really don't. What is Masonry's purpose? Is it a time for a bunch of guys to get together and tell dirty jokes over really bad chicken and green beans? Is it a time for brethren to get in touch with their spirituality, enter into contemplative practices, or is it an organization that you just have to join in order to be able to become a Shriner? Masonry, by and large, especially since it's so federated, it doesn't have this kind of synthesized or consolidated identity anymore, and therefore the ultimate purpose of Freemasonry is lost and ultimately conflicted, depending on who you talk to. You're going to have, if you talk to 10 brothers about what the true purpose of Masonry is, you're going to get 15 different answers in a fist fight.
On Facebook. On Facebook alone. Number 6, and this is, I realize I'm being a bit of a buzzkill here, but I feel like we need to be kind of honest about, where our shortcomings are, so we can perfect them. Number 6, we make virtually no impact on the outside world.
So I have a hard time with this one, because I kind of I believe that Masonry's true impact should be internal on the lives of the men who are a part of it, and that those external impacts are part of the natural progression of the internal impacts of Freemasonry. So, I'm one of those folks who's like, no, Masonry isn't supposed to be a charitable organization. It's supposed to be a personal and spiritual development organization, and that charity and that benefit to society should be a natural extension of those men becoming better citizens and better people.
But if you were an outsider looking in, how would you know if the Masonic program, as it were, was legit, was effective, was, like if I'm sort of considering joining and you say, well, it's an internal thing, what would be the evidence, right? I mean, wouldn't you think that people who had gone through that program, right? In other words, like if you say, well, Harvard is a great business education. Well, how do we know this? Because look at all the CEOs and look at all the billionaires and all the people who graduated from Harvard Business School who are very, very successful now. We have this track record. We can say, you know what? Harvard has made a big impact on the world of business. Okay, right? Bring it on, Harvard, right? And so,
well, we could arguably try to do the same thing with Masonry. Look, there's that guy, he's a Mason. There's that guy, he's a Mason. And there's that guy, he's a Mason. These are all great guys who give back to the community. Now, I think we get into that squishy area of correlation doesn't necessarily equal causality. And I think with Masonry, it's a lot harder than perhaps Harvard in order to draw that causal linkages. But at the same time, I don't necessarily if that's for us to draw.
But let's go back 100 years, right? If you were to look at the movers and shakers of society, right? And I'm as guilty as anybody else at this, right? We have these lovely lists of famous Freemasons. Oh, look, Charles Darwin was a Freemason and Thomas Edison was a Freemason and Eli Whitney was a like all these like people who had a deep and lasting effect on society. The commonality of all those men were that they were Freemasons, right? We can't really point to that today. And when we can, I mean, half the time we're embarrassed by it, right? Michael Richards is oh, wait, it's hard. It's hard.
Ernst Borgnine was a good dude.
He was a great dude. I was fortunate enough to meet him. The sweetest man, right? And look, there are guys like look, we've met him, we've had him on our shows. There are great guys in Masonry, and that's one of the reasons I love Freemasonry, because you will not find guys like this anywhere else. But in terms of, again, from an outsider's perspective looking in, like as to, why aren't people joining? It's because there's no evidence that says, in other words, if you say, well, we're going to make good men better, how? What's the evidence of that? Where's the,
We can't tell you that.
It's a secret. And then finally,
yeah.
Number 7.
Yeah, pay your $100 and maybe you'll find it. We got this great one-day class. You can do it all in one day.
That's right. You can do it all in one day. It's a YouTube channel. And finally, number 7, we have lost the elites. So there's no aspirational need to join.
Oh, man. Yeah.
It's tough.
So I'll mostly agree with that one. So I will give you that. And I think that is just a product of the lack of value proposition and then the preponderance of other things. Or preponderance of other things to concern oneself with. We still have a couple, we have a couple celebrities here and there in Masonry, but yeah, it's not, our Masons today aren't quite having perhaps the impact that the Masons of the late 1700s did.
Yeah. And what I would say too is that, like, I mean, one of the great things about Brother Borgnine is that if you visited his lodge, you'd see him there. Right? I don't know that that's necessarily true of our celebrity Masons, right? I mean, a lot of them tend to be made at sight. It's mostly kind of a ceremonial thing. Not all of them, right? But some of them.
Yeah, been there, done that, got the ring.
Yeah, exactly. So here's my question. So you've talked me off a ledge, Doctor. Is there any hope? Is there, like what's going to turn this around? I mean, if it's as simple as bringing back the McGuffey Reader, I'd say let's bring it back. Let's read it in lodge. But I don't think that that's necessarily the answer. And I wonder if there is one, and if there isn't, what's to become of us?
So, hmm, is there any hope? And I would, ask a question in response to that question, which would be, what to what end, or what is the aim? Because if the aim is to restore Freemasonry to its prominence, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, before the Morgan Affair, of course, or if Masonry, or if the aim is to um, bring us back up to 1959, pre-decline numbers, I would say no. I don't think society is at the same point we were at, back in those two time periods, and for a multitude of reasons that we spent the last hour discussing.
Yeah.
But I would argue that that's not necessarily the aim of Freemasonry today. If the aim of Freemasonry is to cultivate a cadre of men who can think critically and who can make a positive impact on society using the tenets and the philosophies represented within the Masonic fraternity, then I would say yes, there absolutely is hope. Freemasonry today will most likely not cease to exist in 2040, like John Ruark says, but it will exist in a completely different plane from how it exists today and how it existed 50 and 100 years ago, and I think that's okay.
And I guess for me, a little less concerned about the prominence, because if I was joining an organization for social prominence, like Freemasonry isn't it. It's like whenever I explain to my colleagues in
Not so much.
advertising about it, right? It comes off as being very geeky, very, which, look, I'm a geek, so it's fine. It's all good to me, but I sort of agree with you. I feel like we kind of have to get some of these things in order just to prevent us from bleeding to death, as it were. To the point where, I mean, look, maybe here's the thing. Like I look at some of the other, you know, what I would call high quality Masonic obediences that we consider clandestine, right? But they have very, very high standards as to who they let in. The work requirements are much more rigorous than what we provide, what we require of our candidates. And they're incredibly small compared to us but they are a little bit more influential around the world. They do kind of move and shake behind the scenes. And they do make a difference to in other words, they don't have the same kind of churn that we have, where you get, guys coming in, they get there, they go, is this all there is? And then they're out of here. To me, that would be like a healthy Freemasonry. Like, if we could just prevent this kind of constant churn and get it so that, look, I'm going to, in September, I become a 20-year Mason, and I don't regret a minute I don't regret a minute of having been a Mason, but I think about all the guys that I went through with who are no longer Masons. And I like, where did we fail them? And so I guess my question is, and this will probably be the last question for the show, is, in your mind, what does that Masonry in 2040 look like? What do we have to look
Ooh,
forward to?
wow. Um, what do we have to look forward to? I think we. Hmm. So I think there's going to be a lot less standardization. I think the Grand Lodge system is largely unsustainable at present, and I think the nature of that instability is going to it's going to exaggerate exponentially over the next 10 to 20 years. So what I think is going to happen is Freemasonry as an organization is going to continue to decline, but you will see pockets of Freemasonry thriving in urban centers, and you'll also see the advent of a virtual Masonic experience, filling in all of the gaps in the rural and suburban areas. I think Freemasonry will begin to be very much individualistic in its and kind of its experience. You will have it's kind of like how we have affinity lodges today, but I see that trend growing so that Freemasonry almost becomes a mechanism whereby you find other groups of men who are interested in the same types of things, be it karate, ham radio, certain academic affiliations or trade affiliations. Um, and I think it'll, again, I see us moving even further away from the kind of communitarianism philosophy that we talked about a little bit earlier into, okay, you really like rock music and you're a musician, so this is the lodge that you're going to be interested in joining. Oh, hey, they meet online, go have fun. I really think that that's going to be the advent of, or I really think that's what Masonry is going to be like in 2040s. You're going to have different masonries for different folks, and it's going to be easier than ever to find a Masonic experience that that fits your own individual needs. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad way to go.
So Jeff Woolsey, he just sort of said cyber masons. So you think that that's going to be a reality?
I think it'll be a reality, but I'm good friends with Nicholas Lane out of Castle Island Virtual Lodge, and he was down here for Esotericon a couple weeks ago, and we had a really good chat about the concept of cyber masonry. And the fact of the matter is, neither Nicholas nor I believe that cyber masonry is a replacement for brick and mortar lodge masonry today. You just can't replace that experience of going and actually fellowshipping in person with brethren with a virtual completely online experience. They don't map one for one. However, masonry, cyber masonry, and going to lodge online can augment that experience by providing additional means to meet new brethren from across the world or engage in more regular Masonic educational activities, etc. What I'm instead arguing is that I think the merits of that brick and mortar lodge fellowshipping and person experience will continue to decline as masonry becomes more and more sparse, because as lodges close and as you have fewer lodges in the area, brethren who will still want to get that Masonic teaching and that Masonic education will perhaps opt for an online or a virtual Masonic experience instead of driving 300 miles to their closest lodge. And so I think as Masonry continues its decline, that's going to become a reality where cyber Masonry will no longer be an augmentation of the Masonic experience, but it will eventually be some brethren's whole Masonic experience just out of necessity. And again, I wouldn't see that happen in urban areas. I think the brick and mortar masonry in urban areas of Washington, D.C. or San Diego or what have you will still continue to exist because you have the population that densely packed that you have kind of that minimum threshold of Masons in the same area where they'll be able to keep lodges running. But I think as Masonry continues to decline, especially out in the flyover states where population is much less dense, you're going to find folks having to travel 500 miles to a lodge. And if they can just hop online and get a similar enough experience, they will choose to do that instead.
You bring up an interesting point because that's something that I've always been envious of you guys. That you guys can go up to a Masonic Con one weekend and an Esotericon another weekend, and if you're in Chicago, you're kind of locked, right? The density is just not there, where you only have to travel 3 or 4 hours to have a really stellar experience. I mean, you can travel 3 or 4 hours and find yourself in a very, very small rural town before you get to that next, big lodge that is able to put something like that on. So, yeah, I do see
Well,
that.
so I will say, I will say that there's not a big lodge that puts on things like this. These are brethren that are filling a need, and so John and I drove 11 hours to Masonicon, and we had 4 brethren total put on Esotericon here, and so it was here because we all lived here. But there's no reason why brethren out of Chicago couldn't organize a Masonic educational conference on on the same scale as Masonicon or Esotericon. It's just a matter of we for Esotericon in particular, we had very few Virginia Masons there from our own district. We had like 3 from our own district outside of the folks who are actually putting it on. But we had people come from California and Canada for it. So, I don't necessarily think that that these events are a product of having a kind of a microcosm of densely packed Masons in the same area, because the fact of the matter is most of the Masons in this area didn't show up.
Well, I stand corrected, and I feel a lot better about that. Well, cool. I think there was one last thing that I wanted to ask you about, and now I can't remember what it is.
I'm married, but I appreciate the offer.
Yep. Well, I guess that would probably be a good place to wrap it up. So tell me, is there anything you guys want to plug right now? I mean, other than TMR, any upcoming events?
Oh wow! So yeah, Masonic Roundtable every Thursday night at 9:30 Eastern. So check us out. Running strong, 260 plus episodes, not stopping anytime soon. If you're going to be in the Ohio area in August, I'm going to be at Camp Masonry, and I am unveiling 2 brand new programs that I may or may not have started writing yet. One is going to be on Masonic Research 101 and demystifying the process of doing Masonic research and presenting Masonic education in Lodge, because that's something that I'm very passionate about. And there seems to be this aura of mystery, especially among newer Masons, of I couldn't do Masonic research, or I wouldn't know where to start, or I couldn't present in Lodge. And the fact of the matter is, you can and you should, because you could be one day in the craft and you have something that is going to be of value from an educational perspective to your fellow brethren. So that's one of my presentations is going to be just tips and tricks for doing your own Masonic research. The other presentation actually takes place right before the Master Mason's degree. They're having a Grand Master's class, and that presentation is going to look at a little bit of the development of the Master Mason's degree, specifically through the lens of archetypes of fidelity. So we know of at least two myths that factored very prominently in early early versions of the Masonic third degree, and something that rings very home for me uh, with these mythologies are the emphasis on keeping yourself faithful. Um, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and explore some other archetypes of fidelity throughout history and various cultures and various world religions, and how they may have played an impact in the development of the Masonic third degree as well. So if you want to check that out, take a look at Camp Masonry on Facebook. It's in Toledo, Ohio, August 9th through 11th, and I hope to see you guys there.
That sounds great. Thank you. You're an excellent therapist. You definitely talked me off the ledge. This is the part of the show where we thank our executive producers for making this show possible. If you'd like to become an executive producer, please visit us at our Patreon page. It's patreon.com/X-Oriente, and every pledge helps. We should be getting back to our regular Jason next week. We've got a bunch of guests lined up. Jason, thank you. It's always such an honor to have you and just pretty much everybody who comes on from TMR. It's always a quality experience. It's always a joy to have your point of view on the show.
If nothing else, I've got better hair than the other guy.
True. And thanks to everybody who showed up in the comments. The comments are why we do this as a video. We're still on Facebook, but if you're listening to this for the first time, please go over and also subscribe to our YouTube channel, because we'd like to eventually transition everything over to YouTube. And you can do that on youtube.com/X-Oriente. We're going to have everything referenced in the show notes. You can get those at xoriente.com. Just look for the typically when the show goes into the feed, you can find us pretty much everywhere you get your podcasts. You can have the Amazon Echo play us. We're on Apple iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, pretty much all the usual suspects. So wherever you get your podcast, you should be able to subscribe to X-Oriente. Thank you guys for being here, and we'll see you next week.